Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, my dear brothers and sisters. Today we are going to discuss a subject essential to our faith. The 5 reasons why the chosen ones struggle with lust. Yes, I understood perfectly. You want each section of the script to develop with a distinct style for each part, while maintaining thematic coherence, without repetition, and captivating the viewer's attention at each stage. I will now work on the first point of the section to begin, keeping your objective in mind. Once you are satisfied with this first part, we can continue with the next ones. I will start with the first part on the human nature and temptations, with a deep and introspective writing style. You can let me know of any changes or adjustments as you go along. 1. Human nature and temptations, fitra and nafsu. One of the most fascinating aspects of the human soul is its duality. On the one hand, we have this divine spark within us, this nature which naturally pushes us towards the search for good, truth, and beauty. It is this pure heart, this intimate essence, which seeks peace and tranquility in submission to Allah. But on the other hand, we are also confronted with this part of ourselves, this nafs, lower soul, which constantly seeks to free itself from constraints, to give in to desires and temptations, even when these desires only serve to distance us from our ultimate goal. And therein lies the real challenge of spiritual life, this inner battle. Temptation is not a phenomenon external to man, it is anchored in its very nature. Everyone, without exception, experiences desires. Beauty, wealth, comfort, and of course sensuality are part of what the human soul instinctively seeks. In Islam, this is not bad in itself. These desires are a natural part of nature, human nature created by Allah. But it is their management, their mastery, which determines the spiritual journey of the individual. When the believer is confronted with desires that he perceives as temptations, he should not feel guilty for having experienced these feelings. It's a human reaction, a challenge to overcome. It's more about how he reacts to them that makes all the difference. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said in a hadith, "There is not one among you who does not have temptations, but the difference between believers and others is their ability to control their desires. It is not the ordeal that is the fault, but the way in which it is overcome." Temptation should not be seen as a failure, but rather as an opportunity to refine one's faith. This fight between nafs and nature is a silent war that plays out within each of us. The divine soul which seeks purity, and the lower soul which seeks to satisfy its immediate desires, fight tirelessly. This inner war is one of the most difficult one can wage. And those who are seen as the chosen ones, the believers who aspire to a high degree of piety and devotion, are not immune from this struggle. In fact, their trials may be even more intensified, as they seek to draw closer to Allah in a deeper way. The higher one rises in spirituality, the more complex the trials become, and the greater the temptations. But this ordeal is not a meaningless burden. It is in the struggle against these desires that the beauty of the spiritual journey lies. Allah, in His infinite wisdom, does not test us to fail, but to purify our hearts, strengthen our faith, and draw us closer to Him. Each time the believer resists a temptation, he takes a further step on the path of virtue. It is not temptation that defines our character, but how we choose to deal with it. As the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "The best among you is he who fights against himself." It is not a question of running away from desires, but of learning to control them, to channel them in the right way, so that they do not lead us towards the destruction of our soul. Desires linked to sensuality in particular are among the most difficult to control, because they touch on deep aspects of our being. Islam recognizes this difficulty and offers a path to salvation. It is not a question of completely repressing these desires, but of directing them towards objectives consistent with the principles of the faith. Marriage in Islam is one of the purest ways to satisfy physical desires, but always within the framework of the law of Allah. It's not a question of repression, but of redirection. It is not the act itself that is problematic, but the way in which it is experienced and in what context it is expressed. When talking about temptation in Islamic spirituality, it is essential to understand that not every desire is inherently evil. It only becomes problematic when it is fed and maintained excessively to the detriment of our connection with Allah and our mission in life. The human soul, in its pure form, seeks to elevate itself, to transcend these desires to achieve a higher form of spiritual satisfaction. It is a and the quest for lasting inner peace. True peace comes not from the immediate satisfaction of desires, but from their management in compliance with divine laws. I can continue to develop the other parts in a similar way, diversifying the tone and style, depending on what you want for each section. Let me know if this style and approach suits you for the first section. 2. Modern society and its distractions. In the modern world, the allure of sensuality and sexuality is omnipresent. Today's society constantly bombards us with images and messages that exalt physical beauty, sexual attraction, and the immediate gratification of desires. Social media, advertising, and even popular culture continually push us to seek personal pleasure and ignore the deep spiritual values that prevail in Islam. Believers, even if they are deeply committed to their faith, can find themselves exposed to these distractions. Even those who choose to walk away from physical temptations through faith and prayer can be influenced by environments that glorify selfishness and immediate pleasure. It's a constant struggle. How to remain faithful to Allah's way in a world where everything seems to be designed to awaken and satisfy increasingly insatiable desires. The Quran warns us of the dangers of giving in to these distractions. And do not follow in the footsteps of Satan, for he is an open enemy to you. Quran 36:60. The challenge is learning to navigate this world while remaining true to our spiritual values. In this quest for inner purity, the believer must preserve himself by means such as visual abstinence, contemplation of the divine, and isolation from harmful environments. 3. The need for inner purification, tazkiyah. Purification of the soul, or tazkiyah, is at the heart of a Muslim's spiritual quest. This purification is not only a matter of outward practices, such as prayer or fasting, but also of inner transformation. It involves a constant struggle to purify one's heart from negative influences and worldly desires, and to draw closer to the presence of Allah. Human desires, including those related to sexuality, can obscure the clarity of the soul and distance the believer from his ultimate goal, the satisfaction of Allah. In this context, the fight against lust is also a process of purification. Every time the believer resists impetuous desire and chooses the path of obedience to Allah, he takes a step toward purifying his heart. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, said, "The strong believer is one who controls his soul and resists temptations, not one who is physically strong." This hadith shows that true strength lies in the ability to control one's desires and submit them to the will of Allah. The soul, through this process of purification, becomes lighter, clearer, and more receptive to divine guidance. This purification is continuous, because the desires of the nafs never disappear completely, but they become more manageable with time and consistent commitment to the way of Allah. 4. Spiritual loneliness and isolation. Another factor that can make the fight against desire even more difficult is spiritual loneliness. The believers seeking spiritual elevation, especially those seeking a deeper connection with Allah, may find themselves in times of solitude, far from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. While this solitude can be beneficial for meditation and contemplation, it can also create internal vulnerabilities. Isolation can sometimes fuel desires, as the mind seeks to fill the void with thoughts and feelings that are difficult to control. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, warned against excessive isolation, emphasizing that it is essential to maintain relationships with other believers. Spiritual fraternity is an important support in the journey of faith. Islam encourages a strong and united community, which supports each person in their fight against temptations. An individual alone in their spiritual journey, without a virtuous circle around them, may find themselves more likely to succumb to their desires. In this struggle, it is important to remember that solitude can be beneficial if used to draw closer to Allah, but it must be balanced by the presence of brothers and sisters of faith who can help strengthen piety and protect against temptations. 5. The test of Allah and the fight against the ego. The struggle against desires is actually a divine test, a means by which Allah evaluates the sincerity of the believer. Every trial, every temptation, is an opportunity to demonstrate our faith and our submission to the will of Allah. The Quran reminds us that everything that happens to us, whether good or bad, is a form of trial, and that only Allah knows how we will react to these challenges. Indeed, the ego, or nafs, is the biggest obstacle in this fight. It is often our own inner organ that pushes us to seek what brings us immediate satisfaction, rather than what is actually beneficial to us, to question ourselves and renounce our own will in favor of that of Allah. This requires constant vigilance, sincere prayer, and trust in the mercy of Allah. The Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught us that the effort to overcome the desires of the ego is a form of jihad, an internal struggle to purify one's soul and remain faithful to the path of truth. This test from Allah is not a punishment, but an opportunity to draw closer to Him, refine our character, and strengthen our faith. In summary, the struggle against lust in the life of a believer is a profound spiritual trial and constant test. Even the chosen ones, those who seek closeness to Allah, can face this struggle. The important thing is not to avoid temptation, but to fight against it with patience, faith, and trust in the mercy of Allah.